Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with Part 2 from Symbolism of the Three Degrees by Oliver Day Street, Part 2, the Fellowcraft Degree, the Jewels of a Fellowcraft. The very means of gaining admission into a Fellowcraft lodge, alluding to the three jewels of a Fellowcraft, are made to typify the processes of communicating, acquiring and preserving knowledge. The attentive ear receives the sound from the instructive tongue, and the mysteries of Freemasonry, as indeed all other knowledge, are safely lodged in the repository of faithful breasts. The working tools. The plumb, square and level were the appropriate tools of the operative fellowcraft mason. To the master or overseer fell the duty of superintendence, to the entered apprentice that of gathering and rough-hewing the materials. But to the fellowcraft fell the labor of actual construction. This involved the laying of level foundations and courses, the erection of perpendicular walls, and the bringing of the stones to perfectly rectangular shape. These labors necessitated the constant use by the operative fellowcraft mason of the plumb, square and level. Their operative uses very appropriately symbolize the analogous processes in the building of human character. This symbolical application of these implements of the builder is by no means recent. It dates back even among the Chinese more than 700 years before Christ. 500 years before Christ, what we call the Golden Rule was by the Chinese called the principle of acting on the square. Mencius, the great Chinese philosopher who lived in the 3rd century before Christ, teaches that men should apply the square and level to their lives, and speaking figuratively says that he who would acquire wisdom must make use of the square and compasses. Boaz and Jachin. Solomon, in accordance with the common practice of his day, placed 2 immense and highly ornate pillars or columns at the entrance of his temple. It is well known that King Hiram did the like for the great temple to Melkarth erected by him at Tyre. Many other instances might be cited. Whence originated this custom has been a matter for much speculation. We have seen what was the ancient conception of the form of the earth. To their world, the Strait of Gibraltar appeared to be a veritable door of entry. On either side of this entrance rose 2 enormous rock promontories, Abila and Calpe, now called Gibraltar and Ceuta, which completely commanded egress and ingress and are familiarly known as the Pillars of Hercules. They were believed by the ancients to mark the western boundary of the world. Many have seen in these 2 vast columns of stone, set by nature to the entrance of the then known world, the counterparts of the pillars so often set by the ancients at the entrance to their temples, which were to them, as the lodge is to us, symbols of the world. The first objects that engage the attention of the fellowcraft on his way to the middle chamber are the representatives of those pillars at the entrance to Solomon's temple. In addition to the explanation given in the lodge, they undoubtedly have also an allusion to the 2 legendary pillars of Enoch upon which tradition tells us all the wisdom of the ancient world was inscribed in order to preserve it against inundation and conflagrations. Standing at the very threshold of Solomon's temple, as well as of the Fellowcraft Lodge, they admonish us that after a proper moral training, the acquisition of wisdom is the next necessary preparation for a useful and successful life. Their names, Boaz and Jachin, possess also a moral signification, meaning together that, in strength, God will establish his house. Symbolically applied to the candidate, they mean that God will firmly establish the moral and spiritual edifice of the just and upright man. The globes. The idea that the globes upon the 2 brazen pillars represent the globes celestial and terrestrial is certainly modern. The globular form of the earth was unknown to the ancients. Except to a few profound thinkers like Plato, the conception of the earth as a sphere was utterly foreign. Not until about the time of the discovery of America did this fact become generally understood. Moreover, the Bible, at least in English translations, says nothing of any globes upon the pillars, but distinctly states that there were made 2 chapiters of molten brass to set upon the tops of the pillars, and that upon the tops of the pillars was lily work. 1 Kings 7:16-22. The more recent revisions of the Bible call the chapiters by their more familiar name of capitals. The learned Jewish rabbi Solomon Jehudi speaks of them as pommels, a word signifying a globular ornament. It is well known that many of the architectural features and ornamental designs of Solomon's temple were borrowed from the Egyptians. The so-called lily work was unquestionably some form of water lily or lotus pattern of ornamentation so common in ancient architecture and which even now is employed in conventionalized forms nearly everywhere. It sometimes assumes the form of the lotus leaf, at others of the full-blown blossom, and at others still of the bud. Our common egg and dart pattern is a development therefrom. At the time of Solomon, one of the most frequent and at the same time one of the most beautiful of the lotus or water lily designs was the lotus bud capital, which often assumed an egg-like or oval shape. It is accurately indicated by the word pommel, and indeed this term is employed in some of our Masonic monitors in lieu of the term globes. There seems little reason to doubt that the two brazen pillars were columns of the Egyptian style with the lotus bud capitals. Their great diameter, as compared to their height, about 6 diameters, is another strong evidence of their Egyptian derivation. Furthermore, we know that winged globular ornaments, sometimes of immense size, were extensively employed by the Egyptians in adorning the entrances to their temples. The lotus or water lily was the sacred plant of the Egyptians, and among other things, signified universality. The conclusion, therefore, seems reasonable that if there was anything like globes on the two brazen pillars, they were not true globes of the earth and of the heavens, but representations of the lotus bud. If so, though the symbol has not been accurately perpetuated, the symbolism has. There is another ancient conception to which the idea of globes upon the pillars may be related. From remotest times, men must have observed that numerous forms of life proceeded from an egg. This observation gave rise to the belief, which we know to have been widely disseminated in ancient times, and which modern science has almost completely confirmed, that life in every form proceeds from an egg. This supposed universal source of life became to the ancients the symbol of the source of things universal. In other words, the egg was the symbol of the universal mother. It is easily perceivable that to a people entertaining these ideas, globes or eggs mounted upon columns would convey the idea of universality. Lily work. In addition to the lotus capitals, no doubt the two pillars were, in keeping with the universal custom of the time, further ornamented with various forms of the lotus or water lily design. The familiar token of peace with us is the palm branch, but to the Egyptian and the Jew, this office was fulfilled by the lotus or water lily. It is therefore with precise accuracy that we say that the lotus or Egyptian water lily, an entirely different plant from our lily, denotes peace. The network. The network which adorned the capitals or chapiters of the pillars might be more familiarly described as lattice work. Curious specimens of this ornamentation are found in ancient and medieval architecture, particularly in that of the Magistri Comacini, or Comacine masters of northern Italy. Many of these are of the most beautiful and intricate designs, and without either beginning or end. A more appropriate emblem of unity than these could not be conceived. It is interesting to note in this connection that recently a very gifted woman, Mrs. Lucy Baxter, writing under the nom de plume of Leda Scott, has in her splendid book, The Cathedral Builders, adduced much evidence to prove that our modern Freemasonry is derived from these same Magistri Comacini, and through them from the Collegia Fabrorum, or colleges of builders, of the pre-Christian Roman era. To my mind, one of the strongest of these evidences is the common possession and employment of this network ornamentation. See the Comacines by W. Ravenscroft. This tracing of our society back to the Roman building societies of the 8th century before Christ, if it can be sustained, carries us back to the time when we know that building societies were common not only in Rome, but in Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Palestine. Indeed, it is impossible to explain the erection of such architectural wonders as the great pyramids and temples of Egypt, Asia, Greece, and Rome without supposing the existence at that time of building societies or associations of architects embracing within themselves the most brilliant intellects and skillful workmen, not only then living, but whose superior the world has never since seen. In other words, precisely such a society as our traditions teach built King Solomon's temple. Evidences of ancient history point to the existence of such a brotherhood known as the Dionysian architects. At Tyre, the home of the two Hierams at the time of the building of the temple, and it was to this place, according to Scripture, that Solomon sent when he wanted artisans competent to carry out his great design. The pomegranate. The pomegranate, which also adorned the capitals of the pillars, is a symbol of great antiquity, but its meaning seems to have been sacredly guarded. Pausanias, who wrote about 150 AD, calls it aporeto logos, i.e. a forbidden mystery. Ancient deities were often depicted holding this fruit in their hands, and this Achilles Statius, Bishop of Alexandria, says had a mystical meaning. The Syrians at Damascus anciently worshipped a god whom they called Rimmon, and this we know to be the Hebrew word for pomegranate. Cumberland, Bishop of Peterborough, a most learned antiquarian, guessed that on account of the great number of its seeds, a pomegranate in the hand of a god denoted fruitfulness or fecundity. This corresponds closely enough with the meaning that we, as Masons, attach to it, that of plenty. Operative and speculative Masonry. The candidate is informed that there are two kinds of Masonry, operative and speculative. The one, the erection of material edifices to shelter us from the inclemencies of the seasons. The other, the building of that moral, religious and spiritual edifice, human life and character, that house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. He's reminded of the historical fact that our ancient brethren wrought in both kinds of masonry, while we work in speculative only. With this distinction in mind, the candidate is expected to be able to grasp the allegorical meanings of the succeeding ceremonies. We do not regard speculative masonry and non-operative masonry as necessarily synonymous terms. It seems clear that from the remotest times, the operative builders were organized into societies or guilds. Though exclusively composed of operative builders, it is quite likely that they possessed speculative doctrines. We know they adorned their edifices with symbols of many kinds, and that this continued for ages. It is scarcely conceivable that the operative builders could have thus dealt with symbols for so long a time without eventually having come to regard them as their own, and without attaching to them moral and religious meanings. If we suppose that in the beginning the workman was employed by the owner, and that he built only as he was directed and added only such adornment and symbolism as he was specifically instructed, and that this continued to be the case for a long time, it is inevitable that the workman would after a while commence to add symbols of his own accord, and that in course of time this would become a common feature of all buildings, particularly those of a sacred character. Undoubtedly, one of the original objects of the secrecy observed by Freemasons was to promote knowledge and skill in architecture and to preserve the trade secrets of the craft among its members. At that period, it was composed almost exclusively of operative masons, and so continued for many centuries. But gradually the outside world became cognizant that within the tiled recesses of its lodges were taught, by means of most impressive ceremonies, many of the greatest truths of morals and religion. Non-Masons, therefore, began to seek admission to its mysteries, and the most distinguished for knowledge and virtue were received into its ranks. We may well believe that at this stage the test of worthiness applied to the non-operative seeking admission was rigorous in the extreme. Gradually, the non-operative, or as we would say, the speculative members, began to outweigh in numbers and influence the operative members, and eventually the society became purely speculative. It was, however, a long time before the transformation was complete, beginning probably about AD 1450 and extending down to 1717. Scarce 200 years ago, lodges existed whose membership was exclusively operative, others exclusively speculative, and others whose membership was mixed. As the membership of the fraternity thus changed, its mission also became altered. It therefore admits of little doubt that our fraternity is derived from an ancient society of operative builders. Both the external and the internal evidences are so numerous that this fact may be regarded as unquestionable. A question then arises, and one which in a large measure affects the meanings of our symbols in every degree. How can it be explained that this society came to be called the royal craft? Royal tradition. The claim that our society has from the most ancient times enjoyed the favor, the patronage, the association, and in some instances the membership of many of the greatest monarchs of the past has subjected us to much ridicule. It is declared that royalty would scorn to associate with a society of mere operative builders, and that such traditions among us must be set down to mere pride and boasting. Another that has created quite as much laughter at our expense is the claim that our society dates back to the beginning of architecture. Understand that we do not insist that we have historical warrant for these claims. We merely insist that they have been neither disproved nor shown to be unreasonable or unlikely. We have scanty enough references to schools, colleges, or societies of builders existing in ancient times, but their existence is proved by the buildings themselves. It is unbelievable that such structures as adorned Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and Palestine, to say nothing of Greece and Rome, could have resulted from the disorganized efforts of individual masons and architects, however skillful they may have been. Such knowledge is not, and presumably never was, inherited or intuitive. It can now, and presumably always could be, acquired only by years of hard study from some source where the accumulated learning of all the past was preserved. There must have been some organized institution in which the necessary learning could not only be preserved from generation to generation, but where it could be acquired. It was a time when, printing being unknown and writing slow and difficult, books were few and costly. Hence, knowledge of the art of building, like all other knowledge, was transmitted by oral communication from father to son, from teacher to pupil, from master to apprentice. It would naturally result that knowledge so rare and so difficult to obtain, and of such personal advantage to the possessor, should be guarded with great care. A society possessing it must inevitably have become a secret one, to the extent at least of withholding its trade secrets from the public at large. It is a safe conclusion that wherever we find in ancient times great architectural works, there existed alongside them a society of architects of a more or less secret nature who designed and built them. Thus, we rationally account for the existence in most ancient times of building societies making secrets of their trade knowledge. The little evidence of a direct character which we possess is therefore sufficient to prove their existence. Our traditions along these lines are, therefore, in accord with what might be reasonably expected. But how are we to account for, or rather to prove, the possession of these ancient operative societies of philosophical, moral, and religious tenets and secrets? In other words, while an operative society of builders appears necessary to account for the buildings themselves, what causes could give rise within it or alongside of it to a speculative masonry? Our traditions claim for our society cordial, if not intimate, relations in the early times, not only with the heads of the church, but with the heads of the state, not only with the priesthood, but with the royalty. Are these claims likely or unlikely, reasonable or unreasonable, or are they mere presumptuous boasts that ever a society of builders enjoyed the patronage, not to say the association, of kings and priests? The buildings themselves prove another thing, that the men who could design and construct the greatest of them were the equals intellectuality of any king or priest who ever lived. There was nothing in association with such men derogatory to the dignity of monarch or high priest. The buildings themselves establish another fact, that in the earliest times the operative builders were employed in the service of, which is but another way of saying enjoyed the patronage of, kings and priests. They prove this because, with few exceptions, they are temples of religion erected under the immediate direction of the monarch. We credit these priests and monarchs with little intelligence to suppose that their curiosity and desire to learn would not be aroused by witnessing the rise of such stupendous and magnificent structures. On the other hand, however willing the builders might be to impart knowledge of this art to them, they could not learn without coming into intimate association with the builders. We cannot conceive how intelligent monarchs and priests could fail to enter into cordial relations of some sort with such master artists, whose services they were constantly requiring. The more enlightened a monarch or priest, the closer and warmer would be their relation. To this very natural result, and not to mere vainglory, may be attributed the fact that it is the greatest monarchs and priests of the past with whom our society claims association. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.